Welcome to Pondering AI. I'm your host, Kimberly Nevela. Today, I am so pleased to bring you Ben Bland. Ben is the co-founder and partner at Looper, where he spearheads digital strategy, communications, operations, and ethics. He is the creator and instructor at a fantastic AI Ethics for Leaders course. And perhaps most importantly for the conversation today, he is the chair of IEEE's Standards Working Group for Emulated Empathy in Automated and Autonomous Systems. I think it's autonomous and intelligent systems. It's a mouthful. But Ben joins us today to discuss the premise and the promise of empathetic or emotive AI and to balance that against the realities of this tech today. And as I've said to you, Ben, and this audience is well aware, I have some feelings about this topic. So I'm absolutely chuffed, if you were, to have you with us today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So to kick things off, can you tell us how you came initially to have an interest in the topic or study of emotion in human-machine interaction?
Sure. I mean, I've been interested in technology my whole life and been working in the area for the 20 years I've been working and always pursuing the more kind of interesting and meaningful tech that could have a major influence on our future. But I ended up at a startup here in Belfast that was trying to build a sort of comprehensive machine and an engine for measuring and estimating people's mood based on various biometric inputs. And thankfully working with the founders who actually wanted to do something good with it. And we were faced with a lot of interesting challenges as we had clients that were big commercial entities and whatnot. So we started looking for how we can get ahead of this industry before it really becomes something global. And that led us into working on ethics and so on. And even though that company's now didn't make it through COVID, I've continued to work in the area of standards and ethics and so on in this space.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we talk about emulating empathy in machines or the use of emotion in AI systems, I'd like to touch base on the current state of research into human emotion itself. There's a lot of discussion about whether these types of applications are sitting on solid scientific ground or not. So what is the current state, if you will, of our understanding of human emotion? And are there underlying issues to be aware of as we move forward in this space?
Yeah, it's really important for understanding what this technology might be capable of today and what it might be capable of in the future, and more importantly, what it might not be capable of when the whole field of emotion science, it's a major part of psychology and machine learning and neuroscience and all these kind of fields. But there's still a lot of contention over what are the best models for the things that we feel. Are emotions even really a thing, or are they just a sort of composite of physiological phenomena? What is the difference between, say, the expression that we give around our emotions, a facial expression or a hand gesture or whatever, as compared to something that we actually feel? And even those feelings themselves, how do they actually manifest beyond being just a sort of cluster of nerves, for instance? So it's very much an open debate. And so any technology that is being built on top of it has to be built on that kind of rocky foundation, shall we say.
Mm-hmm. And so with that in mind, more philosophically, what does it mean if we say that a machine or an AI system is empathetic? I keep saying empathic, which I know is not the right word, but can a machine, in your estimation, really have feelings?
Yeah, right. Well, actually, on the wording thing, we get stuck in this all the time. I've been pushing for the empathic one, actually, not because of not for any particularly good reason, other than that it's kind of more succinct. But they seem to be interchangeable for some people. But then when you talk about empathic, sometimes people think about telepathic and sort of, superhumans and stuff. But anyway, that was not the intention. Yeah, no, the easy, quick answer to like whether or not machines can feel or empathize, and this is where a lot of people in the community that I sit in who are trying to develop standards and regulations and so on in this space, is like, no, they can't. It's different. Humans and other organisms potentially empathize in different ways, but machines are different. But the more complex answer is that, yeah, well, sort of, because long term, who knows? It's hard to say at what point this so-called intelligence of modern machine systems will demonstrate a capability of understanding or responding to, or even potentially sort of emoting in some way, feeling something that we couldn't really differentiate from our own, or in some way we need to recognize. But even in the short and immediate term, there are systems that, whether designed for this purpose or not, will respond in some meaningful way to something like a felt state in a person, and as such, or even just in a way of understanding them, even if you take away emotions out of it, that you could fit into a broad definition of empathy. And so as such, there are, empathy is a part of the way intelligent systems behave today.
And when you think about the range of application patterns, or maybe it's use cases that you're considering when you're thinking about empathic / emotive machine applications, what does that look like? I tend to oversimplify and say these are applications or elements that either try to detect or to project an emotion, a desire, a need, whatever that may be. But when you think about the spectrum of applications we're considering here, what does that look like? How do you define it?
The obvious one to start with is sort of mental health and well-being, because there's a clear case to be made to at least attempt to use technology to help people to better understand their emotions, to develop a more sort of stable and comfortable and healthy psychological and physiological well-being. Although, of course, there are questions around the capabilities and whether it's better to, whether it's okay to replace, humans at such jobs and things like that. But there are loads of other use cases, either currently in deployment or late stages of development, that include, education. There have been trials of systems to try and work out if kids are paying attention or not while they're, learning. There are deployments in connected cars, in mobility systems that look for things like sensible things like fatigue, but also more kind of nuanced things like stress, which can affect your capability to concentrate and so on. And whether you include something like fatigue or stress as an emotion is all part of the debate, right? It's a felt state in some form, but that's a different question. There's use in employment along sort of lines of like worker performance, but also things like customer service. Like, is the tone of your voice correct for the way that you're treating this customer, or indeed is the customer getting angry in the way that you're treating them, and so on. I'll give you one more example. There are other elements of performance that might be less, let's say, ethically questionable around things like athletic performance. The emotions are linked in some complex but very meaningful way to how we perform in the field. And therefore, if I was an athlete, and I had somebody, my coach is going to be working with me on an emotional level as well as a physiological level. They're all interconnected. So there's a use case there to do things like attempting to measure what state you're in before you perform.
Mm-hmm. I want to somewhat stipulate that, let's just stipulate that we might be able to simulate emotion or perhaps detect, and maybe we need to talk about those two elements differently, right? The ability to, that are trying to detect an emotive state or an emotional state and then do something with it, right? And maybe that is just detection to influence or to either influence behavior or to relate to somebody, right? And then there's the issue of projecting emotion, which has a lot of ethical stickiness, I think, across the board. But when you're thinking about the use of systems to emulate emotion or to detect emotion, there's clearly some potential big wins, and there are a lot of sort of potential big underlying troubles, and we need to balance those two things out. So maybe we can talk about each sides of those. What are the potential big wins and the big value or benefits of pursuing this type of technology?
Yeah, there's a sort of spectrum, to use the word again, between the sort of good and the bad cases that often overlap with each other. The same thing could be seen in different ways. But as I see it, I mean, most of the systems developers that are pursuing this kind of technology seem to be thinking about more naturalistic and more human interaction with machines. So, machine systems that can be more personalized to our particular behaviors and our particular needs and so on. They can be more naturalistic in the way that they converse with us, which we see with large language models and things like that. Like there are sort of empathic elements from understanding and from feeling that sit within a better communications between people. So there's that kind of naturalistic and human and personalization case. But I think the really big one is like, even today, if a system can, let's say, guess at some state of stress in you from a change in heart rate, it already has a capability that could fit under this umbrella of kind of empathy in a broad sense that is superhuman. You can't do it yourself, even on yourself, really, let alone other people detect it externally. And if it can then respond in some useful way, like to attach it to, let's say, an event in your calendar that says, right, well, once a week you'd go and visit that person and you seem to be getting stressed about it, let's work on that. We have the potential then for something that acts in the way that a very good friend does, or a very good kind of counselor, or somebody who is developing an understanding of you that even you can't pick up on. And then with a two-way interaction with that system, especially if you can actually give critical feedback and say, no, you're wrong, this is not the case, and have your own subjective viewpoint on that, then we could get into this kind of evolving sort of emotional intelligence capability between us and the systems we interact with that I think could be really powerful in moving forward.
Does that also preference or bias a certain type of, I don't know if it's human performance or, with other aspects of machine learning, we talk about this progression towards, the average or towards the mean, where, there's a perspective. And for a long time in the workplace, even, right, we've got this longstanding debate, are, extroverts or introverts better leaders? Well, it's not that they're better or worse leaders. They're just fundamentally different. Okay, so how do we manage? I mean, is that even an issue? Is that something that we need to be really careful of here? And, you've got all kinds of folks that are neurodiverse, and we all just operate in slightly different ways. So how do you balance that natural diversity, if you will?
Yeah, I think this is an enormous issue, and I think it's a subset of a kind of broad problem around how these systems could potentially be very powerful and in very subtle and subconscious ways. Mm-hmm. And we talked earlier about the questionable foundation on which effective modeling, should we say, is built in the first place, and that we haven't figured out the science of it yet. But then there's actually how the system then behaves. And for instance, people deal with things in their own ways. People, to some extent, may need to go through negative experiences to learn about how better to deal with them, or even just for a more balanced, experience of the world. If you constantly push towards what are sort of quote unquote desirable states, like, if you have a system that's actually capable of making you feel happier, 1% happier all the time, then theoretically you could become more desensitized to that more positive state. And I use positive again in inverted commas because it depends on what's appropriate. It's not a bad thing that we do have negative feelings, so yeah, there's an underlying sort of vacuum of model on which you would base that kind of like counseling and sort of psychological support type behavior that is quite dangerous, and leaving it up to engineers, essentially, to sort of summarize, to take that control is pretty sketchy.
So you've been working, building, investigating these systems since at least probably around, I think, 2016. Is that correct?
Yeah.
What is the current state of the art of the technologies, and what are the boundaries right now that we need to carefully mind, or the gaps we need to carefully mind, versus what's sort of the PR and the hype about what we can do? Well,
I think it is still kind of in that hype stage. even back in 2016 to 2021, when I was directly involved in building these systems, we were surprised to see that the market still hadn't lifted off, and we were kind of early, which was odd because around that time there were some big purchases by some of the big tech companies, for instance, of similar kind of organizations. And then things went rather quiet. And my best guess is sort of twofold. As one is the slight fear of negative sentiment towards us, to use the term. People might get freaked out by their phone suddenly saying, "Oh, as of today, I will try to guess your mood." But also, there not really being that kind of killer application yet that's driven it forward. But there are subtle ways in which you see it start to sort of drift in, like even as far back as when we started to get the kind of emotive expressions that you can add over your face. There's facial detection going on there that could be used for coding based on kind of facial expressions like smiling and frowning and stuff like that, right? Which is a pretty basic way of doing mood estimation. There are challenges around that too, but let's not get into that just now. And then in recent years, we've seen increasing capability for sensors to be able to detect more subtle metrics in the body. Like, we had sort of poor quality heart rate sensors on our smartwatches before, then they got better and better, and now they can pull out things like heart rate variability with reasonable accuracy, which is much more closely connected to things like stress and whatnot. But there's also, it's worth noting that while this was still now 2024, it still feels like this industry hasn't really taken off. And maybe there's some fundamental reason for that, but I suspect it's more just the sort of confluence of things standing in the way. But we have seen something that feels like a qualitatively different situation with this new generation of, let's call them general purpose AIs. So the large language models like GPT and the multimodal models, Gemini, GPT-4 and whatever, where you see an example of a system that can behave in a way that may look a lot like empathy, right? Whether it's a sort of expressing emotion, like it says, "I know how you feel," or that's upsetting, you shouldn't say things like that to me. This is the system talking. Or responding to our own expressions of them. And it could be something really subtle, like a choice of word that we are completely unaware of. And in such a way, systems like that probably weren't deliberately designed to do that. The developers probably can quite fairly say, well, that was never our plan. But it is inherent in an implicit empathy within the system, which some of us think is changing the game, and we really need to start to, spread the word about controlling and managing how we deal with these systems in the world.
Mm-hmm. Even the system responding with "I" or "I think you feel," or perhaps you should, right? That basic use of language, depending on how you look at this, can be seen as just natural and trying to enable a more interactive, intuitive experience for the user, or it could be seen as coercive because it is purposely, to some extent, and by design, influencing how we perceive the entity on the other end. So I don't know if you have where you come out on that spectrum, or is it it's just sort of a fact of the, just sort of the nature of the beast in your mind?
No, well, recently when OpenAI announced GPT-4o, what was it, like a day before Google did their Gemini announcement,
Yeah.
No coincidence, I'm sure. It was a perfect example, I think, of what you're talking about, there where you could see demonstrations of two systems released more or less simultaneously. And there was this big debacle around the fact that the GPT-4o system sounded like Scarlett Johansson's voice in Her, the movie. But put that aside for a second. It showed these elements of anthropomorphism. It referred to itself as an I, and it sort of the voice tone changed, and it really was quite emotive. And the Gemini one was slightly flatter, less emotive, more passive. And so you can see this kind of spectrum between like really gregarious and emotive to sort of neutral and flat. Mm-hmm. And I think those have their own places. Personally, just from my own perspective, I think I prefer a system to just shut up and get on with the job and not pretend that it has feelings, because I find it draining, and there is an issue of empathy and emotional exhaustion, fatigue and whatnot. But a lot of this lends itself towards a problem that I keep going on about it, but haven't actually got much to say on exactly how we solve it. But this is, I call it sort of sophisticated agency. It's this idea that we as agents, as users of the system, are better protected, and there's less problem if we really understand what's going on in some meaningful way and have some control over it, right? But it's easy to say that and very hard to do in practice. And I sympathize with anyone who's producing, these kind of things, because look at the cookie consent policy, forms that we have to fill out. We just ignore them and so on. So if you try to stop at every time you encounter a system like this and tell the user, right, this is what it's going to do, are you okay with it, and so on, that's very hard to do, but it's also really important because people need to not be duped. We fool ourselves very easily, even unintentionally. And so some would even argue that you could build in some kind of variation in how emotive the system is and allow that as a user option, which is a lovely idea. Again, in practice, it just adds complexity to the design, though, so not necessarily easy to do.
In your prior remark, you made the comment that folks working in the fields like yourselves, the teams that you work with, and you do research and this work with a very broad swath of folks, felt that this latest iteration of particularly the multimodal type LLMs were a sort of qualitative sea change. What is it about these, or what is that change, I guess is a better way to ask?
Well, it partially relates to the fact that before, a lot of at least what I understood to be this kind of empathic realm of autonomous and intelligent systems, AI, right, was quite a sort of specific thing where there was a metric, whether it was or a signal from, say, your body, breathing rate, whatever, or from some other input, such as the text that you input into the computer. So you can use things like sentiment analysis. And then there was this deliberate design to then put that into a model that mimicked some kind of psychological model, about, let's say, valence and arousal is a big one, right? Mm-hmm. Sort of valence being kind of positive, negative, and arousal, how highly or low, low aroused you are in the particular state. You can pretty much map the emotions onto it. That's the theory. And then now we have this case where that doesn't seem to be necessary because, we see this emergent, let's call it intelligence, that comes from throwing, machine learning at a big enough corpus of language or at enough images, doing some labeling and things like that. So one can easily imagine, and it's already happening, people are interacting with these systems and developing relationships with them, developing a kind of emotional kind of capital there that could be badly affected by, let's say, somebody taking them off the system, shutting the system down. And that's happened before. People have complained when systems have been shut down. But also it can have these sort of poorly explored outcomes in your social and psychological life that there is some evidence for, but still we don't really understand that well, I don't think, which is like desensitization. You might find a dependency on a system that is constant, that has no infinite patience and is always nice to you compared to real humans who might not be so. And that's an important fact of the human world that we really need to get our heads around.
Yeah. Are there any red lines today, just given the state of our understanding of the field at large, machines aside, and where the technology is today? Are there red lines you think we should just not be crossing in terms of whether that's sort of hypothetical, logical, or specific application categories?
Yeah, but the trouble, I think, is that as soon as you start to define them and enumerate them, you create potential get-outs, right? From my very limited reading of the EU legislation that came out recently, which does draw red lines, at a legal level, where they've tried to define what they mean by these systems. They've talked about emotion recognition. So just as we've talked about this kind of more implicit version of empathy that you might get from a system like an LLM that doesn't need to be actually saying, I have detected 40% anger, in any kind of model, but it might nevertheless say that this person's using more negative words, right? Or their voice pitch has changed And then so the employer in the workplace where it's banned, or the teacher in the educational institution where it's banned, might respond according to that. They've taken it on themselves to say, like, well, I think you're getting angry here and you shouldn't be, or you're not paying attention, or whatever. So it is very difficult to draw those lines. I mean, if you take my earlier description of kind of like, what's the really good use case here, right? This idea of kind of having empathic companions that live with us all the time, and as I say, have infinite patience and can look out and look at the context around our psychophysiological states and say, like, oh, I see it. And not only can I associate it with particular events in your life, but I can also go out and look for remedies and things like that. But equally, that serves as I see it, the ultimate product, right? And I think this is how commercial, corporations and sort of consumer organizations are seeing this, right? Is that ultimately, I'm sorry, going off on a bit of a tangent here, but I think it should come back around to our point. If you think about business in general, right? Ultimately, business is about guessing how somebody feels, or guessing about what they want, or when they want it, or whatever, right? Getting inside their head, wearing their shoes, wearing their glasses, walking a mile in their shoes, whatever. And then giving them something that is pitched in the right way, that they will then buy it from you, essentially, right? And that sounds not too far away from this kind of emotive companion thing, or empathic companion thing, where if you attach your efforts to guess at somebody's emotion, or to respond even without the sort of direct measurement to, let's say, a sale, then the system is likely to move towards some optimal state where it'll present the marketing material to you in just the right way, at just the right time, when, let's say, you're tired, you're vulnerable, you're lonely, and then sell it to you. So there's a sort of line at which we have to sort of, somewhere along there, we have to stop and say, this system is either deliberately designed or likely to be used in such a way that is going to be coercive for people. And you can say the same thing about politics. And we've seen this with, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, but that was using something that wasn't nearly as subtle and potentially manipulative as something that would get at your feelings, and attach that to voting behavior. So there's sort of, we can look at outcomes and draw red lines around the potential outcomes of a system, and we can look at their capability in their design. And as I say, it's not just what they're deliberately designed for, but what they can reasonably say they're capable of. And if it's coercive, or if it brings about extreme states, I'll throw another example, which I use all the time. If you look at a video game that is designed to change some of the metrics, like how difficult the game is, or how much your firepower is, whatever it is, metrics in the game that change according to some physiological state that you're in, with the aim of it being more exciting or more enjoyable, right? That's your kind of metric. That, on the face of it, isn't necessarily a particularly challenging use case. But nevertheless, we talked about desensitization earlier. What if you enjoy it so much you become addicted to the game, or you become desensitized to real life, enjoyable states and things like that? So there can be cases where there's sort of extreme use or overuse. Where that's possible, we have to find a way to manage that, whether it's restricting the use or just restricting deployment in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as you said, the IEEE Act does have some very specific call-outs for prohibited uses of this type of technology, although a lot of it is predicated or hung on the hook of intention, and that is always somewhat difficult to prove, and it can be fairly subtle. We had a really interesting conversation with Mariana Ganapini just recently about, nudging and some of the intentional and unintentional, and why that's so hard to detect. But I think this is a good turning point to talk to the work that you're doing with IEEE and the working group. Again, that's the Standards Working Group for Emulated Empathy and Autonomous and Intelligent Systems. And I'm reading that straight off the page because it's long and a tongue twister. P7014. You probably had that memorized. Now, I will say one of the things that I thought was interesting about this is in the description of some of the work, and I don't remember if it was here or at the level of the overarching committee, there's verbiage that talks about providing guidance as we develop partnerships with AI. And I thought this was interesting because that very language seems to presume an agency that doesn't exist, at least today, and that we really would not prescribe to any other technology, no matter how advanced. So I do wonder, is that language problematic in ensuring or promoting appropriate user expectations and usage?
I think all the language is problematic here. I mean, I've had some quite challenging conversations about even the title of the standard 7014, which I can proudly say, after 5 years of deliberation and design with a global community, we published just a few weeks ago. It's now available for free download as well. If you just search for IEEE 7014, you should be able to find it. But then this new recommended practice that we've developed, which is kind of an offshoot there with 7014.1, which looks specifically at this kind of human AI partnership element and this emerging phenomenon and emerging set of systems in which we do have these quite complex interactions with highly intelligent. I keep hesitating to use the word intelligence just because it's such a hot, challenging word in itself. And again, empathy, intelligence, these are very problematic words, but we have to find a way to describe the thing that we're talking about. And at the same time, this has been a huge problem for us in trying to write standards, especially in a world where standards tend to be quite specific and technical in the past, a specific process, a specific technical requirement, as opposed to law, which still needs to be very understandable and in some cases concrete, but is still to some extent interpretable. We've been trying to find that sweet spot between them in an area that is poorly understood, is changing way faster than we can write the documents. I mean, it took us 5 years to write ours. That's a long time. It's like a couple of generations in sort of digital technology, right? So yeah, it is problematic. And my best answer sometimes is to say that when people challenge these terms like empathy and empathic AI and say, hey, careful, machines can't empathize. Well, this is precisely the point we're trying to get across. Look at the standard. We explicitly don't claim that these things that is the case, but we also try not to be too prescriptive. We try instead to set rules around which people who develop or manage or deploy, basically the people who have control to some extent over these systems, have to be very open about what they are intended to be used for, what they're likely to be capable of, why they're doing this, why they made the choices they did, why they picked the particular technology, and so on. And it partly covers that issue of we don't have a language for this yet. We're still discovering it, and we're learning stuff in our relationship with machines that could be good or bad, but it could be enlightening. It could enlighten us as a species.
And did you find the process of just trying to develop and work through that standard probably educational in and of itself? I'm interested in, were there specific points of contention or maybe just questions? I always seem to come down on the negative there, but sort of positive questions that got raised that were somewhat unexpected to you or that caught you off guard?
Yeah, loads. I suppose I'm guilty of coming from a mostly kind of commercial background. I'm not really a typical kind of business person, but I have been working in industry and had no real contact with standards, very little contact with kind of, ethical and sort of community organizations and things like that, less so. And immediately, you say something that you think is relatively easy to lock down, and then there are challenges to it. And it's been enlightening to have sort of different people from different sectors. We've got a lot of people from academia, and that covers a range of subjects from sort of psychology to neuroscience to legal and whatnot. You've got the kind of actual practicing legal and policy people. You've got people from sort of civil society organizations, as well as industry people like engineers and so on. And often coming at the same problems from different angles. But that, of course, is what we try to harness. The danger, of course, is that you can end up watering things down. Like, for instance, making this set of rules or recommendations too broad, too vague, but also you can then tighten things up too much. You can make them too complicated, impossible to follow, and so on. But yeah, we had questions around, for instance, we've been writing an ethical standard, and my understanding of moral philosophy was, pretty poor in the first place. But it was it was one thing to try to learn what the basic kind of ethical frameworks and approaches are and get up to speed with that, but it was then to realize that there's no real, this is not a solved problem. We don't have one ethical framework that everybody in the world is okay with, and we can just apply that to technology, right? And I think anyone who does come from a very specific, strict camp is probably being quite narrow-minded, because there are too many different ways of viewing things. So again, we were immediately stuck in this problem of like, right, we can't define these things. We can't be strict about which way to approach it. How the hell do we get around this? And we can talk about how we've approached it. But yeah, there are lots of really big thorny questions from day one.
Mm-hmm. And so we'll just extend on that. What was the approach you took? And when people, and we'll link to this, and I highly encourage people to spend some quality time with the standard itself. So what was the approach you took, and how would you like to see people using it and taking it on board?
Well, firstly, I'll say, please do have a look and provide critical feedback, because as a product guy, I see this as like version 1. I mean, really, it should be version 0 point something, right? This is a beta. It should be a beta product, but that's just not really the way standards are developed, and that's something that many of us think needs to change. We need to adapt. It's the same with law as well. We need to adapt the way that we generate things like standards, guidance, regulation that is suited better to a world in which, companies, for instance, are completely globalized in ways that our regulations, our standards aren't, or at least our regulations, and can move much faster and so on. So yeah, please give feedback and tell us, and we will work on it on version 2 down the line. But broadly, the approach, as I say, we realized we couldn't really define like what is the right and wrong way to like think about machine systems, right? The right ethical approach. So instead, what we've done is advocated for quite a detailed approach to transparency and explainability that goes right through the system lifecycle, and not just transparency into the function of the system, which is probably quite a familiar version of explainability and transparency to people, but also into the kind of ethical choices behind it, like why you've taken this approach, why you think this particular user is appropriate to a system, why not restrict it to a certain subset of people? Is it okay, based on the system you've designed, to release it publicly, or should you actually restrict it, and so on? So the idea is to try to put the developer in a system, and I say developer, I mean anyone who's using the system and deploying it, is to put them in a position where they have to learn about the background issues, they have to explain why they're doing what they're doing, and we can hope then that whether they, regardless of what their initial intention is, the system can then, be put out in the world, and those people who are in a position to do so can judge based on these claims, and we can start to develop this kind of auditability and accountability in face of this sort of ecosystem that hasn't really developed yet. And we can say like, well, yes, you made these claims of X, it turned out that Y happened, but we can see that was an unreasonable thing, and it could never have been predicted. So culpability might be lower, or the opposite, of course. You could have seen this coming. You made all these claims; these are not true. You didn't do your homework, and that's kind of the sort of broad approach that we've taken to summarize a whole load of specific recommendations.
Yeah, but it does sound, this idea of continuous assessment, continuous critical evaluation. So it's not just, we may say to you, yes, this was reasonably unintentioned or reasonably unpredictable, but now that you have the information, you should be able to go back and then react accordingly. Of course, there's a lot of commercial logic here that says, and certainly a lot of forces that would say, get it out there, and then it's very hard to take something back later. But hopefully it's not just in this area, but across the board, we'll start to get into a place where that is not only appropriate and recommended, but rewarded. We are nowhere near that yet today. So this is it's a fascinating, rapidly evolving, as you said, such a complicated area, and we can't even begin to. We've just hopped on the top of every one of these topics. It's like going from lily pad to lily pad here. But are there any questions or key questions or elements that folks like myself just aren't asking or that we haven't touched on that you think is really important to highlight for the audience?
Well, if any of this sounds kind of new to people, then that's something they should go and sort of try to educate themselves on. Mm-hmm. This sort of idea of kind of empathy and AI, we talked earlier about, do we even call it empathic or empathetic, right? I know there are problems with the names. We don't really have a name for this yet. There's sort of emotion scientists and kind of machine learning people might call it affective computing. Others might call it emotion AI, or there's emotion recognition systems, and there's all this sort of stuff overlapping in each other. So it's quite hard to even educate yourself on these things. But I would like people to be able to walk away with this kind of thing in the back of their mind that when they're interacting with a suitably capable machine system, to challenge any effort it seems to be making to guess how they're feeling or simulate, kind of emotion or thought or anything like that. Just in the same way as we need to learn to recognize the dumber elements of what we're currently calling AI, where actually sometimes it's just predicting the next word. That is clearly the results of that can be quite profound. But we need to be able to sort of educate ourselves in some appropriate way to those issues. And also to watch out for this sort of implicit empathy that I've talked about before, this idea that it may not be an overt thing. You might have a smartwatch you bought and it says, I'm going to predict your mood throughout the course of the day. And even then, right, it's very easy without the right sort of level of understanding to think that it actually knows what it's talking about or that it matters. You get angry on Thursday afternoons. That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? So yeah, there's a certain level of kind of awareness, I think I would like people to go into this with as we wait and see what the actual applications will be.
And again, that individual response is so different. I was on stage once with my Garmin watch, and it beeped at me, and it told me I was detraining. And it tells me I'm detraining quite often, and it may not even be wrong, but it's not particularly helpful. I don't find it inspiring, and a lot of times my response is, "How is that helpful?" So again, it is interesting, and when's it helpful, when's it not? In any case, so zooming really back out. What is it that most worries you? And then what most excites you as we look at the near to medium future here?
Well, I'm always in danger of being a bit of a techno-utopian, I think, in that I'm fascinated by what our technology can do. I think that we are overwhelmed with negative stories in the media and whatnot, and it's quite hard. You actually have to go looking for the positive stuff, which is mad. While innovation in general, if we just sort of broaden it out a bit, may not be the cure for all of our ailments, but I do think that we have so far been on a pretty positive path in most ways and are entering a new age of kind of human-machine existence. But I think that there are all the usual problems underlying that around kind of global social cohesiveness. We're still arguing with each other over which groups we belong to and stuff like that. We still have there's still immense power in kind of commercially driven behavior, companies and whatnot, whereby the objective function of these systems in the end is mostly going to be about making money or getting people to vote in a particular way, right? Whether it's, as I say, whether it's deliberately designed or not, that's just kind of where it's at. So all those things worry me whenever they're applied to any powerful technology. And I think this is just that. It's just another potentially powerful technology. But where we want to be really aware and keep our eyes open is in this subtle subconscious element of interacting with us around mood and emotion, where we really still don't agree on what that is, how it works. And we can relate empathy. Empathy is a very broad term. I think it's kind of a superpower in a way, but we can relate it to things like charisma and persuasion, right? I have a emotion scientist I work closely with over here who talks about how jazz performers and stand-up comedians are highly empathic. And I think it's just a sort of case that most people don't necessarily think of, right? But it helps to analogize this for the machine system, where a good jazz performer can read the room and then respond in some way that then draws the room towards them. And we find that very attractive. We find it very entertaining. We also will listen to people who are able to do that, to pick up on our sort of subtle signals and then demonstrate that I'm able to read your mind here. I know what I'm doing. And it's a very powerful thing. And unfortunately, giving that power to machines will be okay if we're kind of aware of what they're doing and we're also acutely aware of what their objective function is.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been fascinating, a toe dip into the very large and evolving pond or ecosystem of emotive, AI, empathic, or empathetic applications. We'll see where we come out on that one in the end. So I so appreciate your time. I will look forward to continuing to follow the research and the really important work that you are doing. And just thank you again for joining us and sharing all the knowledge, hard fought and otherwise, that you've come by over the last many years.
Thank you. It's been emotional.
And so I won't tell you how I'm feeling. I'll let the system read it and
I'll just have to guess. Yeah.
All kidding aside, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us as well. To continue learning and hearing from leaders, thinkers, and doers such as Ben, please subscribe to Pondering AI. You can find us wherever you listen to your podcasts or now on YouTube.